be in Daniel chapter 7 again this evening. For those of you who have not been able to be with us this week, we've been looking at some of the prophecies in the book of Daniel with the view of setting a foundation for a later study this summer in the book of Revelation led by Rick Sparks. The 7th chapter of Daniel is key to understanding some of the later chapters in the book of Revelation. If we've got a good handle on what Daniel 7 teaches, then we should have a pretty good handle of some of the basic principles in Revelation 13 and onward. So we've been looking at this chapter a little bit more in depth perhaps than we would under normal circumstances, because I've got this idea that here later on this summer, if you're able to sit in on Rick's class, some of what he says from chapter 13 onward may make a little bit more contextual sense. So in the 7th chapter of Daniel, we have Daniel seeing this vision in which he watches the rise of 4 great empires, beginning with Babylon. It's represented by a lion with eagle's wings, followed by a bear, raised up on one side, which symbolizes Persia, followed by a leopard with 4 wings, which represents the Greek Empire. And then finally, he sees a beast that he cannot liken to anything on earth. All he says is that it is dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It tramples and devours everything in its path. It has iron teeth. It has 10 horns, and then it has a little horn that grows up after them. So this is a pretty odd-looking beast. It's not like anything that he knows. And he goes on to say that a little bit later in the 7th chapter. Last night we started looking at how that beast is representative of the Roman Empire. And then the 10 horns that come up on that beast are representative of the European kingdoms which conquered the Roman Empire and eventually ruled over the territory in continental Europe that it had once dominated. They began as Germanic tribes migrating from Western Europe and settling down into Central and Western and North Europe. And these are the tribes that eventually become the nations as we know them of France and Spain and Germany and Switzerland and Italy and Austria and England. So these are I guess you might say, those who benefit from the decline of Rome and who eventually become the powers in her place. And then last night we began looking at the most curious part of the vision. I say curious because Daniel himself was very captivated by what he saw here. It really grabbed his attention. If we pick up in verse number 8, Daniel says, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots, and there in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Now if we go down to verse number 11, he says, I watched them because the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched the beast was slain, and its body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. We skip down now to verse number 19. Then I wished to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue of its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head. And the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. Daniel is quite taken by this horn. It's unlike any of the other horns. And there are some things that we can notice just initially about this. And this is just review from last night for those that were here. We notice first of all that it sprang up among those 10 horns, which implies that it is a little like them insofar as it has some sort of civil or temporal power. Those 10 horns represent 10 kingdoms, and we're given that interpretation here in Daniel chapter 7, and this horn is a king or a kingdom as well. So there is some sort of civil or temporal power associated with the horn. We also see that the horn is personified, and what I mean by that is it's given human attributes. It has eyes. It has a mouth. It's able to make war against the saints. So there is something that is quite different about this horn than the others. Even though it comes up among them, it is separate from them, it is unlike them. And that's what really captures, I think, Daniel's attention. We also see that this horn seems to exist along with the beast until the day of judgment. We talked last night about how verses 9 through 11 just seem to indicate the end of time. And we compared some of the statements in verses 9 through 11 to some of the statements in Revelation chapters 19 and 20. In particular, notice in verse number 10, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were open. And we tied that together with almost the exact same statement in the 20th chapter of Revelation, verse number 12, where we have very clearly the end of time, the judgment of all mankind, and that's the scene, I think, that's described here in verse number 10. You've got this mass of people standing in front of the Ancient of Days, who's God the Father. The court is seated. In other words, it is time for judgment to begin. Books are open, which is that statement that's almost verbatim from Revelation chapter 20, verse 12. And then Daniel sees, because of the sound of the pompous words, verse 11, he watches the beast slain, he watches its body destroyed, and it's given to the burning flame. And we noticed in Revelation chapter 19, verse 20, how the beast there is given over to the burning flame as well. There it's the lake of fire, where fire and brimstone burn eternally. So verses 9 through 11 lead me to believe that whatever this horn is, it is going to persist until the end of time and will not ultimately be judged and condemned until Jesus returns and the final judgment of mankind is executed. I went ahead and told the people last night what I believe this little horn represents. And I understand by telling you what it represents, I'm asking you to bear with me as I give you the supporting information afterwards. I think it's better to do it this way so that you know at least where I'm going and can listen, perhaps with an ear and a mind open to this possibility. I believe that the little horn represents the Bishop of Rome, or who we often call the Pope of the Catholic Church. I think that the history behind this supports this particular interpretation. And we began looking at how the papacy had, from very, very early stage, had developed civil authority. There's a couple of key statements. Once again, this is review from last night. In verse number 8, once again, we see that the little horn came up among them. So it's like them in a sense. It's like its fellow horns. It has some sort of temporal authority. We also notice verse 24. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. I mentioned last night that this word kings can often be translated either king or kingdom from the Hebrew, and that's really up to the translator how they render that particular word. So we have 10 kingdoms that come from the single kingdom, Rome, and after them rises another kingdom, or king, if you will. So that leads me to believe there is some sort of civil or temporal authority associated with this little horn. And last night we talked about how as the empire of Rome declined and ultimately fell, that there was a power vacuum created. One thing I did not mention last night was that Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome over to the city that bears his name, Constantinople. He did this in the 4th century. And when he did so, he did create a power vacuum of sorts in the city of Rome. And the Bishop of Rome began to step in and exercise a greater role in the governing of the city of Rome. As I read from Durant last night, the reins and skills of government were handed down by a dying empire to a virile papacy. This is well established by history, and we read some quotations about how progressively the Bishop of Rome began to take on responsibilities beyond just the spiritual, culminating in 754 AD when he begged, Pope Stephen II begged Pepin the Short, the king of the Franks, who was the father of Charlemagne, to come down to Italy, invade the territory of the Lombards, and take from the Lombards what he believed was rightfully the papacy's property. He went so far as to send Pope Stephen II a letter that was purported to have been written by Peter the Apostle, threatening Pepin the Short with eternal condemnation if he did not come down there and take that land that rightfully belonged to the vicar of Peter and hand it back over to its rightful owners. And this is exactly what Pepin the Short did. It didn't take much to motivate him when he's threatened with eternal condemnation. So he comes down, he takes that territory, he gives it over to the Bishop of Rome, and thus we have established in 754 AD the Papal States. And in order to create the Papal States, Pepin the Short had to take from the rightful owners 3 territories in order to create this single state. If you recall, in this vision that Daniel has, that this little horn roots out, or pulls up by the roots, 3 other horns. And this seems to line up with what's happening here in chapter 7. That's essentially what we talked about last night. I wanted just to give a little bit more lengthy introduction, knowing that we have people here in the audience who were not here last night. So now we reviewed a little bit of what we got into last night. Now I'd like to look at something that's beyond just the civil authority of the papal power into what I will call the preeminence of the papal power. How the papacy viewed itself as the greatest power on earth. And in order to do that, I want to point out a couple of statements in verse 20 and in verse 24. In verse number 20, notice at the end of the verse, as Daniel is looking at this horn, as he's comparing it to the 10 horns, he says that his appearance was greater than his fellows. His appearance was greater than his fellows. In other words, there were some attributes about this horn that set him apart and above his peers, if you will. Then later on in verse number 24, notice in verse 24, Daniel says, the angel who's explained the vision says to Daniel, the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall rise from his kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. And that's where I get the idea of those 3 territories being taken from the rightful owners and given over to the Bishop of Rome. He shall be different from the 3 ones. That's the key phrase there. He is much different than his predecessors. So we have something that is in contrast to these previous horns. And I think that this points towards the preeminence of the papacy. And let me explain to you what I mean by that statement. The papacy was greater because of its perceived spiritual authority. The visible difference between the papacy and the kings of Europe lay in the spiritual authority that was assigned to the Bishop of Rome. And the papacy used this perceived spiritual authority as a tool to secure broader civil authority. As the centuries unfolded, the popes boldly asserted their absolute civil authority on spiritual grounds. In 1081, Gregory VII penned the following statement in a letter, quote, "Who can doubt that the bishops of Christ are the fathers and masters of kings, the princes of all the faithful? Hence, a very little knowledge is sufficient to make it plain that bishops are the superiors of kings." This is what I mean by the preeminence of the Bishop of Rome. And he was assigning that preeminence not only to himself, but to every bishopric throughout the Catholic Church. That each bishopric was greater than the kings. That the spiritual authority of the church was over the local rulers. This is ultimately, I think, expressed in 800 AD, when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the West. I mentioned Pepin the Short, who gave the Pope those papal states in 754 AD. He's the father of Charlemagne. Charlemagne is crowned on New Year's Day, 800 AD. And those who were present at the coronation shouted this as the Pope lowered the crown onto the king, Charlemagne. This is what they said, quote, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, to the great and pacific Emperor of the Romans, long life and victory." Will Durant says that after Charlemagne's coronation,